Fantastic. Okay, so we are here to talk about how digital can improve grant making, both for charities and for funders. To do that, we're hoping it's going to be some kind of relatively kind of short presentations, and then lots of chance for us all to talk about this stuff together. To begin with, please do use the chat function. We'll put in kind of questions. It'd be lovely if you can introduce yourself to one another, so we know who you are, perhaps where you're from, what organisation you're representing, if you are. And as I said, if you'd like to put your cameras on, please do. We're also going to be using Mentimeter for some live polling a couple of times. So we'll talk you through that when we get to those screens. But as you'll see on the screen in front of you, we're going to kind of rattle through a few things. We're going to have a quick check-in to make sure we've all kind of landed in the session. We're going to talk a little bit about the opportunities and barriers to effective grant making. Going to talk a little bit about how digital can improve some aspects, particularly talking about Grant Advisor UK. And where it gets particularly kind of interactive, I hope, is where we start talking about where we're being inspired about what good practice looks like. And where we're being inspired for different things that can help us understand how we can improve either the relationship between grant makers and charities, the way in which grant making is done, or kind of any aspect of kind of that experience. And just say the work we do at CAST, we sometimes act as a grant maker. We often sit alongside grant makers as they're delivering digital projects, sometimes helping them kind of design funds, sometimes helping the charities that they then fund. So we've got experience of being both a charity seeking funds, as well as a grant maker trying to put together the most effective programs. So hopefully we're in a good space. But let's start off with that chat. And if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat box, that would be wonderful. But the first thing we're going to do is check in, to say kind of hello to one another, and to make sure this session works as well as it can do for you. For those of you who have not used Menti before, you can either wave your phone over that QR code and it'll take you to the link, or you can go to menti.com/ that number on the screen in front of you, and it'll take you to a screen that has a couple of questions. And in a moment, Ellen will switch screens and you see the results coming in. What we're looking to hear really is kind of what excites you about using digital to improve grant making, just to see if we can understand kind of how best to tailor this session. And if you can tell us a little bit more about who you are. And if the questions aren't enough for you, please do use the chat function. If there are any things you particularly want to get from this session, particular questions you want to ask, particular points you want to make, put them in and we'll make sure they're kind of brought in. But for the first few minutes, let's dive into Menti, and we'll see how that begins to go.
So awesome, looks like, yeah, a bit of a mix of people. I think a couple more responses coming on in, but yeah, great to see a mix of different people in the room. And our next question, what excites you about using digital to improve grant making? I'll wait for a few more responses to come in. I can reshare my screen. I'm struggling to see some answers. Here they are popping up, which is great. Fab, thank you. I'll share my screen so you can see what everyone else is writing. And fab, yeah, lots of awesome responses popping up, giving power to people, learning new approaches, reducing admin. We'll give you another minute and Dad might do a bit of a summary of some of the responses.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you, Ellen. That's great. So, and just looking across those, let's make sure we do come back to these. There's quite a lot in there about, well, there's stuff around kind of transparency and relationships and shifting power. There's something there about kind of smoothing the processes and reducing admin, which we can look back to. And there's one in there about reuse as well. Where's that one gone? About reducing costs. There's one about reuse, I thought.
Yeah, making things easier to share and reuse.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thanks. So let's bring all those things together. But let's start off by asking Liam to share. So Liam's a creative director at Hubbub, is involved as a funder, and has been thinking about some of the opportunities and barriers. So Liam, lovely to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Afternoon now, actually. Yeah, so similar to CAST, Hubbub are a charity who generally are the recipients of the fund. For anyone who isn't familiar with Hubbub, we are an environmental organisation, charity. We design campaigns to inspire action that's good for the environment and everyone. And like I said, like we're typically a grant recipient. So we've experienced the ways of rigorous data collection, reporting metrics. So we know from experience that funders who impose fewer restrictions often allow us to do our best work. And it was quite interesting that most of our work is with corporates, and we started to become a grant giver about 4 years ago. And in that time, we've redistributed from our partners through to community groups and different charities and organisations over £6 million in funding, and that figure is quickly increasing over the next couple of years. So yeah, we found ourselves in a position of becoming a grant giver, and having quite fresh eyes and not having done grant giving before, I guess we applied the approach that we generally apply to all of projects, which is to try and be quite agile, to test and learn, and to put the user at the centre of the design process. So we use user-centered design so that we can better understand the context, the constraints, the situation that the people that we're supporting, we hope to support with funding, are in. And we did try and design our grant fund to allow them to do their best work. So we consider a whole range of things, which I'll come on to shortly. So that is really helpful in terms of knowing, like, okay, let's figure out what works. Let's understand our user. We ourselves are the recipients of grants, so we know what works for us and what doesn't. And then we start to think about like the strategy. So like, as with any organization, your vision, your core values are really important. And it's important that those core values run as a thread through all of the work we do. So we ask ourselves the question, like, does our grant making process align with our intended outcomes? And does it align with our organizational vision and mission? So that's something which we continue to think about when we're developing grant funds. In terms of some of the practical stuff, some of our learning that we've gained, what we see as being really important, and that's from the position of a grant giver, and what we know is important for groups, is the element of trust. So like for us, we try and build trust with the groups and offer trust in return. Organizations generally know what's best for their community, for their needs, for their beneficiaries. And so it's important for us to build that relationship with them so that we can provide flexibility and try and reduce the power dynamic of being like a funder grantee traditional relationship where there's quite a strong power imbalance, and try and become more like partners. So it's not like we're purchasing outcomes for a grant, it's more like we're investing in an organization to deliver shared outcomes. And in that, we often consider what can we as an organization do in addition to the funds for our partners, the corporates that we work with, how can we better support those groups? So we generally try and collaborate with them through the design, the implementation of grants. And a lot of that is around testing what works and sharing with the groups to see what they think about it and make improvements as we go along. So there's that real cultural thing about testing and learning in addition to the bigger strategic questions. And then very quickly, some of the things that we've done, some of the learnings we've got is like engagement and promotion. So like sometimes I think you just need a megaphone. Like groups might not be able to hear about it. So we have learned that you need to brand a fund and use targeted promotion. So we work with our comms team to come up with different ways, different channels that we can promote the funds. We try and share on LinkedIn, different social media platforms, word of mouth through our networks. We also think about like who and how we've engaged people so that we can try and make it more open for communities and organizations that might traditionally not be aware of grants. We try and provide transparency and manage expectations. So, you know, timelines, information, make it as crystal clear as you can. Who can and can't apply, what's the processes involved for monitoring a requirement. So that clarity from the get-go is really important. And we learn that through the groups that we worked with. Often being time poor, they don't want to waste their time on something which is going to, you know, cause them lots of time spent on reporting. Simplicity is absolutely fundamental. So thinking about the reading age of language, no jargon, forms you use, translations, you know, other things that try and make things as simple for people as possible. We also try and make our funding proportionate to the amount of, we make our processes proportionate to the amount of funds that we're giving out. And the last point I wanted to just touch on is that thing about testing and learning, like really so important to speak with the groups and understand like what's worked for them. And I know that we're going to talk a bit about Grant Advisor, which can kind of help facilitate that a bit more. Oh, Dan, you're on mute.
Too many screens. I've only been doing this for a few years. Thank you. Liam, that was great. Thank you so much. We're definitely going to build on all those points as we go through the session, and we'll return back if there are any kind of particular questions for Liam or if we want to kind of build on some of those points. When we often work with particularly kind of more traditional grant makers who are trying to kind of think about kind of the role of digital in their work, there are a couple of things we often talk about that are quite difficult if you're trying to support charities to develop digital work. So the first is kind of encouraging charities to be kind of more agile and responsive and user-led doesn't always align with kind of more traditional grant making approaches. And there's a bit of a kind of tension there to hold on to. Like, how do we encourage charities to be kind of more responsive and agile and create their solutions based on new things they're finding out, whilst the grant making processes might be kind of upfront and wanting to understand kind of some of the challenges. So there's something in there that, like, if we're really going to use digital well, we need to think about kind of what design processes sit well around it and how we use those both internally as funders, but also how we encourage charities to use them. I put a link into the chat that kind of describes a little bit more about that. More recently, in fact, just kind of in response to COVID, we did a really big piece of work to provide charities with lots of support around digital. And I put a link in here because one of the benefits of digital, of course, is we can communicate things better, hopefully. I'm hopefully going to demonstrate now. But we can collect things, we can kind of aggregate them, bring them together, and we can share them for reuse. And within that Notion page is the experience of hundreds of charities working through a £5 billion fund to figure out how they can use digital within their own work. And all the resources and tools and experiences are catalogued in there, as well as lots of the outputs and the learning and the outcomes. So there's something in there about kind of how we can use digital to share the things we're creating, share the processes we're using, but also to continue to kind of respond to the needs of charities. There are two other links I'm going to put in here first, just because they came up in that chat. First is like, how do we encourage reuse? So the first is by cataloging stuff and sharing it well. The second is by thinking about how we can open up the things that we're funding to be reused by others. And there's a link there to a set of work that's done by a group of funders across the Catalyst network, trying to figure out how we can kind of reuse things that have already been created. And very finally, to think about how we can kind of reuse or support funders to reuse to enable better use of digital. There's a link there to a small service that we're kind of testing out at the moment. But the reason for sharing those is there are lots of examples of kind of how we can use digital within our work. But this slide focuses on some of the barriers. So despite knowing that digital can be really useful, there are some things we're becoming more and more aware of that we need to address if we're going to really make the most of digital within our work. And the top one on that slide says kind of getting realistic feedback. And very often we know that digital kind of design processes and design processes generally work when you have a really good feedback loop, where you're constantly kind of learning from, testing, orientating your work around the needs, behaviours and expectations of the people you're trying to support. And yet we know as funders, we very often don't have those really good feedback loops. It's missing. So part of this work today is like, how can we kind of burst that bubble, to burst the foundation bubble, or kind of find ways of generating realistic, important feedback to improve what we're doing, the way in which we're acting. Now, sometimes that becomes is because there's a lack of communication, and sometimes, being really honest, it's because of that psychological relationship we have with funders, that we don't want to kind of give them bad feedback. We don't know what that might mean for our future funding or our reputation. We know it's there. It's kind of this power imbalance, and because of that, and because of some of those channels aren't always available or aren't always honestly used, it means we don't have those good feedback cycles to improve our practice. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pause there for a moment. I'm going to hand over to Ellen, particularly to think about how can we use digital to address that feedback loop, first of all, see how digital in this way can be used to improve grant making. Ellen, over to you.
Thanks, Dan and Liam. Yeah, exactly that. So we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers and some of the opportunities. And with that in mind, we want to consider how might we use digital to improve grant making. And I really like what Liam said there around there's lots of testing and learning happening in this space. So you might be testing a new approach, and we'd love to hear what that is later on in the presentation. We're going to share an example of how casts are testing and learning in this space. So I'll talk a bit about Grant Advisor UK. So Grant Advisor UK is a platform which facilitates those feedback loops that Dan mentioned. So open, honest dialogue between grant seekers and grant makers. It's a platform where grant seekers can leave an anonymous review for any UK funder. That could be a trust, a foundation, a corporate. It could be a small funder or a more traditional, larger funder. And yeah, it's really key that the reviews are anonymous, because it means that we've got that safety net of feeling like you can leave really honest feedback without that fear of wondering what might that do to the relationship with the funder. So I'll share a quick video which will give a bit more information about Grant Advisor UK. So we'd love to hear your gut reactions in the chat. Do feel free to share them, or if you've got questions. Grant Advisor UK launched 5 weeks ago today, in fact, and we've been really pleased with the response. So there've been over 2,000 unique visitors to the site, over 8,000 page views, over 40 new reviews written. But we are kind of thinking about now, it looks like in numbers, that's really positive, but what does that mean in practice? What are some of the benefits to both grant seekers and grant makers? We won't play the video again, but we will skip to the next slide. So some of those benefits for grant seekers are, just like we've talked about, around the feedback loops. So it's twofold, really. One is having a direct line for grant seekers to have with their funder. So one of the questions we ask grant seekers on the service is, if you had one piece of advice to give to this funder, what would it be? And this is an example on the left here of an extract from a real review of the service. So a grant seeker sharing, I would really like to see the ability to tweak and resubmit while energy and investment in the project from the partners is still high. And a great thing about the service is not only can this anonymous review be submitted, but the funder can respond too. So it's building those communication pathways. Another real benefit is the opportunity for grant seekers to share with their peers as well. So another question we ask when grant seekers are leaving a review is, what advice would you give to a fellow fundraiser? And again, this is an example of some great advice on the service. So have a clear understanding of your vision, focus on the challenges your stakeholders face, the change you want to create and how to achieve that change. Be collaborative in your approach. So it's great to see kind of how those feedback loops can start benefiting grant seekers and funders, but also build that peer-to-peer insight in the fundraising community. The reviews are anonymous, and we mentioned it could be for any UK funder. So since launching, there have been 2 new funders that have registered on the service. And there's two ways that that works. So a funder can register themselves and we'll support them to start gathering reviews. Or a grant seeker can leave a review for a funder, even if they're not registered on the site yet. There's also hundreds of independent reviews that fundraisers can browse, which is really useful for gaining insight to help with funding applications. And I'll talk a little bit too about some of the benefits for grant makers as well. So for grant makers, when registered on the service, they get lots of different benefits. So to give you a couple, they get ratings of what you're good at. So similar to peer reviews for skills on LinkedIn, ratings for accessibility, and really granular feedback, which you saw some examples of just there, on what they're doing well and what could be improved. There's also, like we mentioned, that space to respond to reviews. So I think one of the key benefits here is it's data and insight that can really help funders be more responsive and accessible to the organizations and causes they want to fund. And it's interesting hearing Liam talk a bit about kind of Hubbub's experience and maybe the differences between small funders and maybe more traditional funders. So CAST's role here is really helping funders of all sizes and ages to make use of the reviews. So helping to pull out themes from the data. So I guess one of the benefits for a smaller funder might be that they can be more agile and responsive, maybe test some new ideas. But also we can build connections between smaller funders and larger funders who've got more experience and might be able to share examples of ideas and approaches that they've already tested. So it's twofold. It's building those relationships between grant seekers and grant makers, but also thinking about, well, what could grant makers learn from each other? It's really key here to highlight as well that anyone that signs up to the service, we can really tell that they're committed to openness and fairness. And we've seen some great examples of what that looks like in practice already. So Paul Hamlin Foundation, one of the funders, signed up to Grant Advisor, and yeah, they've shared some feedback on how they're using the insights from the service to refine their funder practices. So this is a quote here from Sophie saying, the Grant Advisor UK pilot flagged that we're not always easy to reach by phone and our application forms take too long to complete. We're working on improving these to be a more responsive funder. So we can see some really tangible examples of how we can use the insight to make both small and larger changes. And really key to driving that change and innovation is drawing inspiration from others. So that could be turning up today and drawing inspiration from somebody else in this group, or looking at other external organizations and looking at, well, how are they applying digital technology and what could we learn from them? So Grant Advisor UK, for example, we're not the first review platform. We've looked at TripAdvisor, for example, to see, well, what could we learn from them and how their features help those reviews get gathered and shared and changes being made. And Liam's going to talk a little bit about another example of how Hubbub can draw inspiration from others and what we might learn from that too. So I'll hand over to Liam.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, this came about through a conversation around like who in other sectors are doing interesting work to try and increase transparency, openness. And it occurred to me that like we have a really good example with Applied, and Applied are a recruitment software that we use at Hubbub to try and encourage us as an organization to broaden the range of applicants that apply to us and also hear about job applications. So it's a clever piece of software that you can use to build your job listing. And actually, the reason I'm telling you this, I draw parallels from this to grant making. So for me, grant making, grant giving, I see there's lots of crossovers and similarities between recruitment. So if you are applying for a job, it's no different from applying for funding in some respect. You're creating a proposal on behalf of you or your organization. You're trying to compel them to put their faith and trust and investment in you as an organization. It's no different from you trying to get a job. So what Applied does is it uses AI and some other clever software to analyze the text of the job listing. So the approach could be to think about the application wording, the material that you're using to advertise, the criteria, the eligibility, fund, and Applied will give you a score based on the weighting, the gendered weighting of the language that you've used. So using more masculine and more feminine language. It gives you clever prompts as well to consider, like how you might shorten or simplify It gives you the reading age of your documents. So again, it's just gets you to think about, like, for the people that are going to receive this information, are we putting people off through the way it's written? And all the way through to the recruitment, in terms of like how you vet an applicant, it's no different to how you would score a successful, also how you would score someone who's applied for your funding. So it uses these things called SIFT questions, where you're asked 3 questions, which are reflective of the types of tasks or circumstances that you might be in your role, such as like, why are you interested in working at Hubbub? And the applicants have a short answer. They submit their CV in addition. When it comes through to applied, it's blind. You can't see who's written that. But you have to write a really rigorous criteria against which you score those SIFT questions. So you will get, say, if you have 300 applicants for your role, you'll have 300 answers for the first question that come in random order that you assign between you and your colleagues. And you have to score them against the criteria. It then amalgamates them so that each person's given a weighted average across that. But that kind of blind viewing of that means that you're just vetting that information. And I just thought it was really interesting about how they're taking this approach to recruitment and what you could potentially learn for grant giving. And the last point, what they do at the end is they give you, in addition to some prompts around how you might broaden the reach of your advertising channels you might use, they give you a summary report at the end to tell you who have you attracted in the pool of applicants. So how diverse are the applicants, what backgrounds, experiences, ethnicities, genders, etc. So it gives you really good insightful data, and it tells you, I don't know how they do this, but it tells you who you might have missed had you not changed your wording or your processes, and it gives you a score, and it helps track the person from the application process all the way through to the hiring, and tells you a little bit about how that person has been influenced, or how you better catered towards the people that are successful. So yeah, I just thought it was brilliant how other sectors are using like data and process to try and broaden the pool of those to make their processes more transparent and more fair. And then at the end, it automates a score and some really detailed feedback for the person, so that they can see whether or not they got through to that stage, or they didn't get through to that stage rather. Why? What was their score? Where did they fall down upon? So again, brilliant. And I think there's probably a lot we can learn there, because I don't know of any organisations that are that rigorous or have utilised software in that way. Okay, our business idea for another time.
Amazing, thank you, Liam. That's great. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to everyone that's joined now to either ask kind of questions or kind of follow up any kind of clarifications from what you've heard. A chance to share kind of what you're working on or what you're doing, or to kind of talk about any ways that you're kind of being inspired to help improve grant making. So that could be kind of questions or things that you're working on. One thing I will do, because Liam just mentioned there that we haven't seen very many examples of that within our sector. We share another link to a fund that's now live with Power to Change. That's the application page, and if you kind of scroll down to the eligibility, kind of the application process, they're not using AI software, but what they are doing is at each kind of stage, they are doing some analysis of the rejected applications to understand whether there are any consistencies across those, to ensure they're not bringing any kind of new biases to their application process, which is the first time I've ever seen someone do that. I'd be really kind of rigorous, not just looking at your initial criteria, of course all funders are rigorous, but looking at those who are rejected, analysing to look specifically for patterns of exclusion. And if they find any, going back out to those groups to figure out how they can improve their process to make sure it's more equitable. Another kind of inspiring, now this is a good example, I guess, of a test they're running now. We'll probably know around September how well that's gone, what things were spotted, what their responses were. And hopefully if they can kind of share that process and share what's coming from it, then it might be something we can all look to kind of either adopt or understand how that works. Enough from us. This is always kind of the awkward moment where you're asked to kind of contribute, but is there anyone that likes to kind of either ask a question or share some of the work that you're doing to see if kind of collectively we can just kind of make a bit more progress into like, how can we improve grant making through the use of digital?
A question.
Adam.
I guess like interested the extent to which the barrier is a lack of technology to enable these processes. Like, so is it that there's like with these new technologies enable processes that previously people wanted to do but couldn't because the technology wasn't there, versus the extent to which actually it's like changes in practice, and almost the technology is a Trojan horse to try and prompt a broader change in practice in the sector. And if it's the latter, if it's the change in practice, then yeah, like, is technology the primary Trojan horse? Like, are there other levers that need to be pulled alongside it? Yeah, sorry, that's more a reflection than a question, or it's a big question at least.
It's a brilliant big question. I've definitely got those two things are always intertwined, right? New technology afford new practices, and kind of the way in which we want to work can often get kind of stumped by the existing tools that are around us and how we can kind of evolve past them. I guess that there are some examples. So Liam's example earlier on, AI technology allows us, or well, not AI actually, digital technology allows us to look at applications that have been anonymized in some way. That allows us to be a little bit fairer, not a huge amount, but a little bit fairer than perhaps we were when we were looking at people's names, CVs, and pictures. That the example there of power to change, that's not radical new technology, but that's then trying to bring in a new process to be fairer. I think with something like Grant Advisor, I think that anonymity allows kind of the sharing, open public sharing of honest, hopefully honest, anonymous feedback. That's something that can only be done with digital technology, with network technology. But the ambition to create new feedback, that's not something that has just sprung up. That's been there for a long time. So I guess it's a mixture of both, isn't it? How can we use technologies as an opportunity to bring about the practices we want? How can we see what new practices can come from the technologies we have?
Thanks. I'll allow others to chip in. I can share more reflections, but keen to hear from others.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else like to kind of respond to that? Go on then, Adam. You were going to you could chip in further.
Well, I suppose, like, to play devil's advocate slightly, like on the anonymizing applications, for example, like if that were the instinct of organizations and technology were the barrier, then it would be fairly straightforward to ask an admin assistant, for example, to anonymize. Like, so I guess I'm curious at, like, if this were a priority, then the processes could be put in place offline, but they haven't been. And it's almost like I'm thinking about like a theory of change. Like if our objective is like more equal application processes, and we're looking to the blockers to that, to what extent like you introduce a smooth technology, and that means you don't have to ask an admin assistant to do something, and it means that it's like, and it's slick and it looks nice, and it's like, I can definitely see how that might unlock that pathway, but I can also definitely see how it could conceivably not, in a context where there hasn't been that momentum to do it anyway, in a context where it's not impossible to do anyway. It's a frustrating question to ask because there isn't a clear answer. Obviously, like, it's all, you have to move all of these things and try them all at once, and you do lots of you pull one lever and you introduce a smooth technology, and another one about talking to your senior leadership about good practice, and another one about et cetera. So it's not a kind of I know there's not a definitive answer. Yeah, sorry, hence more reflection than specific question.
No, it's great that there's I'm going to find this by the end of this session, a theory of a distance dependency. That's what it's called. So distance from new practice measured against dependency on new technologies. And the theory of innovation, or the theory of change there, says if you try and do both, you're trying to really shift it distance, so the bringing new practices, and you're trying to become reliant on new technologies, then you're in for a really hard time. Ideally, though, you try and kind of shift the practice using existing tools, or you try to introduce new tools to existing practice, and that way there's greater chance of adoption. And I suppose there's something. One of the challenges in working in our sector is that all charities, but trusts and foundations as well, are largely proudly independent of one another, and will follow their own processes that work for them, or bring their own ways because they think that's important. And so maybe there's something here, which is there might be some, there's going to be different speeds of adopting new practice, different priorities, but maybe because technology can reduce some of that kind of distance from where we are now, maybe some of these things can be adopted a bit more quickly.
That's really helpful. I'd love to, if you've got anything on that distance dependency model, I'd love to read that. That's helpful.
I love a good theoretical show. Liam, any kind of reflections on what you're hearing, considering what you're doing at Hubhub?
Actually, I'll put my trustee hat on. I had a trustee meeting last night, and I think your point, Adam, kind of struck a chord in that, because it can sometimes be difficult to make things happen, especially if like it's new and people don't know how it's going to work. You have existing processes. It can be difficult to introduce something that might rock the boat, or there's worries about security, reliability, etc. And Hubhub is quite a small, agile organization where we just give people a lot of freedom to make mistakes and test and learn and do things without some of those worries. As we get bigger, that may change, but anyway, in terms of the trustee thing, yesterday what I was pushing the organization that I'm a trustee to consider is that their why, their vision, their mission, to make sure that their thinking behind every decision aligns to that. And so while outside of the discussion around taking on new technology or embedding it into existing practices, I guess always asking yourself that question, like, does this process align with who we are and what we state that we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it? And can we find ways to test that? And at Hubhub, we use the data insight from end users to guide everything we do. So we don't set up on a solution or an idea unless it's been tested and validated. If you're already in a position where you've jumped into a role, or you're in an organization that has already got predated methods, that's a different scenario and different application of how to change that applies. But from Hubhub's perspective, because we're able to just put the users first, any changes or anything that we implement will always be informed through that approach, and making sure that it aligns. I don't know if I've just gone around the houses a little bit there, but that's kind of where my thinking was.
Right, now thank you. So Steve, I know you're off camera. I don't know if there's anything you particularly wanted to contribute, whether it's a question or a comment, but whilst you kind of ponder that, I'd love to return to your question, Adam. What are the big challenges? What are the big challenges you'd like to overcome? So for those of you on the call that don't know Adam's been an incredible kind of designer within charities and for years, particularly around digital. And has now got a really important role within Nominet as part of the social impact work. So he's acting in a funding organisation that takes a kind of critical design lens to the work. So leaving outside any kind of Nominet specific context, what are the big things that you would like to see change within grant funding?
Blimey, I guess I like picking up, Liam, on your reflection around trustees. I think what trustees pay attention to, I think, has a big impact on what is monitored and measured. And Nominet's slightly different. I'm not going to dive into Nominet specifically, but because we're not purely a grant funder, like Nominet's core business is keeping.uk online, and our grant funding sits alongside that as part of our public benefit mission. And so the kinds of questions our trustees would ask might be very different to Comic Relief's, or kind of an organisation where that was their entire business. The big challenges, I think I'd have to go away and think about it in order to come back with a coherent, sensible answer. You've put me on the spot, Dan.
Or maybe whilst you're thinking of some, rather than the challenge, some of the challenges, I guess, yeah. Having been on both sides of be a grant seeker and wanting to develop brilliant work.
So the reason I moved to work for a funder is because I've spent 10 years in working in charities, like thinking, why on earth is it done like this? Like you look up and you just think, like, who on earth would think that is a good idea? And then you go to a funder and you realize there are loads of reasons, obviously, like because, and it's the same, you pull on these threads upwards and people are not stupid and they're not uncaring. They work within constraints of a system, and the system generally delivers exactly what it's kind of been designed to deliver, even if it hasn't been intentionally designed in that way. So there's a set of priorities and constraints around people that mean that funding is delivered in the way that it is. So it could be that you have external stakeholders who are really concerned about a particular aspect of your funding, and their emphasis on it could be how suitable for media coverage it is. It's not a nominate, we're lucky in that sense, but it could be something like that, and that shapes the way that shapes the questions that your trustees ask. It shapes the kind of internal pressures on you in terms of what you have to produce, and I guess these exist everywhere in the system. These constraints, and so having empathy with the grant managers or the funders, and building a trusting relationship where they can be transparent about what the constraints are that they face, I think is key for. That would be a reflection. It would be something, if I went back to work for a non-profit, that I'd spend a lot more attention, a lot more time on trying to understand the system that my funder is working within, so that I can help them be a better funder, if that makes sense.
I think that's such a brilliant response, and as always with you, it's really kind of empathetic and recognizing that everyone's trying their best and they're within different contexts, and the systems we built were designed, some of them were designed, some unintentional, but have come from a purpose. One of the things that places me, one of the reasons that I'm so grateful for Liam's contribution today is we've got a bit of a challenge. New organisations can adopt some of these new practices more quickly. They don't have that kind of those traditions and those kind of practices and processes that we designed 10, 20, 100 years ago and that have evolved. Liam doesn't have that with Hubbub's kind of a much newer organisation, and there's something really fascinating about how do you kind of help startups do new things in new ways compared to how do you help those incumbent existing organisations kind of evolve their methods of working to kind of bring all those with them. There's another link that's worth sharing called Modern Grant Making, which speaks to some of those issues. What's really interesting about this kind of theory of change is it says to really shift some of those established organisations, it's going to take some time. So why don't we start really supporting people who are, I don't know, classes like middle managers or up and coming kind of stars within organizations, so that by the time they're in positions of greater power, they can kind of shape organizations in these ways. But there's something really interesting there in you focused on building relationships, understanding the context in which people are operating, being open and transparent. It's almost as if you're pointing to the need for something like Grant Advisor UK to exist, which is rather wonderful first of all. So thank you very much. Okay, we are coming up to time, so let's just jump to the next slide if we can, please, Ellen. Thank you for those contributions. Adam, and thank you for yours on the chat as well, Steve. So we have put a whole set of links into this slide deck, which we'll share afterwards. It'd be really grateful if there are any resources that you would like to share. Of course, we'd be very, very grateful if you had a look at Grant Advisor UK. It's going to work when it gets enough people using it, enough funders and enough reviews. That's where it really kind of has an impact. A bit like the version in the US has, where there's enough reviews to help other grant seekers, and there's enough weighted reviews to then influence and support grant makers to shift their behaviours. So please do visit the site, whether you're a funder or a grant seeker. Please do register and have a look. And then if there are any resources you think can help others understand the value of kind of digital within the work or how to improve grant making overall, please share them. Sonia, Ellen, what's the best way of them sharing those, please?
I've just mentioned in the chat that we're going to share the recording and the link to the slide deck on our comms channels. So probably later today or tomorrow, we'll put it on our website and also across our social. So if you can just dive in and add any sources of information and inspiration, that would be wonderful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sonia. And I'll add in the ones that I put in the links as well, because they kind of came from listening to Liam and to others. So it's been lovely seeing you all. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you managed to get some lunch and look forward to catching up soon.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.